When life begins to press you, when the weight on your shoulders feels heavier than what others around you carry, it's not because you've been abandoned. It's because you've been chosen. You see, when God sets someone apart, He doesn't decorate them with comfort. He designs them with challenge. And sometimes the very struggle you are in is the loudest announcement from heaven that you are marked for something greater. So if you've been wondering, why me? Why this? Why now? The answer may not be that you are cursed, but that you are called. When God begins to move in a person's life, the first sign is not always applause or recognition, but separation. He pulls them away from what feels familiar, from the crowd, from the comfort zone they once depended on. Noah was ridiculed for building something no one had ever seen before. Yet his separation preserved his destiny and the destiny of humanity. To be separated often means being misunderstood, because the vision inside of you will not match the circumstances around you. Separation is God's way of drawing a line between where you have been and where you are going. Abraham had to leave his homeland and his relatives to step into the promise of becoming the father of many nations. His comfort had to be exchanged for covenant. The call of God is never casual. It disrupts your surroundings so that you will lean on Him fully, instead of leaning on what feels safe. Separation strips away dependencies that would hold you back from elevation. When David was called, he was not in the palace but in the pasture. He was separated from his brothers, tending sheep, seemingly insignificant in the eyes of men. Yet it was in that separation that God trained him with lions and bears so he could face Goliath. Elevation does not begin in public view. It begins in the unseen place, where God is shaping character in the shadows before the spotlight comes. Joseph knew separation better than most. He was taken from his father's house, sold into slavery by his own brothers, and thrown into prison after false accusations. Each layer of separation felt like rejection, but it was redirection. Without separation from his family, Joseph would never have reached the palace. Without separation through betrayal, he would never have been in position to save a nation from famine. God uses separation as the bridge that carries you toward elevation. When God separates you, loneliness often becomes your companion. Friends may drift, opportunities may dry up, and people who once cheered you may no longer stand beside you. But this loneliness is not empty, it is filled with divine presence. God clears the room so that you will learn His voice above all others. He removes distraction so you will recognize that elevation does not come by human hands, but by His Spirit. Separation also exposes the motives of those around you. As you rise, not everyone can rise with you. Some people were only assigned to the season you are leaving, not the destiny you are entering. God allows separation to filter relationships, revealing who is truly aligned with His call on your life. What feels like abandonment is often divine pruning, preparing you for greater fruitfulness in the next level. There is also a refining that happens in separation. When Israel was delivered from Egypt, God did not immediately place them in the promised land. He separated them in the wilderness to strip away Egypt's mindset before they could inherit Canaan. The wilderness is the classroom of separation, where your faith is tested, your heart is purified, and your dependence shifts fully onto God. Elevation without refinement would only lead to collapse. Elevation requires capacity, and capacity is built in separation. Just as a seed must be buried in darkness before it pushes through the soil into the light, your season of hiddenness is building the strength you will need for the heights. What looks like burial is actually planting. What feels like an ending is a beginning. God uses the silence, the obscurity, and the stillness of separation to grow roots deep enough to sustain your elevation. Separation is never accidental, it is intentional. God does not isolate without purpose. Every tear, every delay, every closed door is a tool in His hand to shape you for what is coming. When you embrace separation, you position yourself to be elevated in ways that your own effort could never achieve. Separation becomes the evidence that heaven has something bigger in store than what your current environment can handle. And so when separation comes, it is not a sign that you are forgotten, but that you are being forged. It is heaven's announcement that elevation is on the horizon, even if you cannot yet see it. What feels like loss is often the seed of promotion. What feels like rejection is the doorway to divine direction. In the kingdom of God, separation always precedes elevation. Pressure has a way of revealing what is hidden beneath the surface. It is the weight that squeezes out the truth of who you are and what you carry. When God assigns you to something greater, He does not shield you from pressure. He allows it to prepare you, just as grapes must be crushed to release their sweetest juice. Your calling cannot flow freely until pressure has done its work in your life. It may feel like the burden is too much, but the heaviness is often the clearest sign that heaven has trusted you with a divine responsibility. Think about the way diamonds are formed. They are not created in comfort or under calm conditions. They are produced deep in the earth, where heat and pressure collide to transform ordinary carbon into something extraordinary. In the same way, the assignments God places on His children will often bring them into situations that feel impossible to survive. Yet it is in those moments that transformation takes place. What once looked ordinary begins to shine with uncommon beauty. When you feel pressed on every side, it is not always a signal that you are out of order. Sometimes it means you are right where God wants you to be. The greater the assignment, the greater the resistance. And with it, the greater the pressure. That pressure sharpens your faith, toughens your resolve, and proves that your foundation is unshakable. Without it, your assignment would remain theoretical, never tested, never validated. With it, you are forged into someone capable of carrying what God has entrusted to you. Pressure is also God's tool to strip away self-reliance. When the weight is heavier than your own strength can carry, you discover the necessity of His power. It is in the crushing moments that prayers become more urgent, worship becomes more authentic, and dependence on God becomes non-negotiable. The assignment on your life is not designed to be completed in human effort alone, and the pressure reminds you of that truth every step of the way. Look at Moses, called to lead an entire nation out of bondage. The pressure he faced was overwhelming, the cries of the people, the threats of Pharaoh, the Red Sea before him, and the wilderness behind him. Yet every ounce of pressure confirmed that he was chosen for the task. Without the heaviness of that burden, the miracle of the parted sea, the manna from heaven, and the water from the rock would never have been revealed. Pressure and assignment are inseparable companions. Even Jesus faced the weight of pressure in the Garden of Gethsemane. The assignment of the cross pressed on him so heavily that he sweat drops of blood. That kind of weight was evidence that the mission before him was not ordinary. It was divine. The pressure was not punishment. It was proof that the salvation of humanity rested upon his obedience. The greater the call, the greater the crushing. Yet from that crushing came resurrection and victory. Pressure also refines motives. It forces you to ask yourself why you are truly pursuing the path God has set before you. Are you in it for applause, recognition, or comfort? Or are you willing to endure hardship for the sake of obedience? Pressure eliminates the superficial and exposes the authentic. Those who are only chasing after convenience fall away when the heat intensifies, but those with genuine calling remain, proving that their assignment is real. Another thing about pressure is that it produces resilience. Each time you withstand the weight without breaking, you gain a new level of strength for the next stage of your assignment. Just as muscles grow stronger by pushing against resistance, your spiritual capacity expands every time you endure what once seemed impossible. The pressure of today is training you for the weight of tomorrow's opportunities. There is also a glory in pressure that cannot be denied. When people see you under circumstances that should have crushed you, yet you are still standing, they realize there is something greater holding you together. Your endurance under pressure becomes a testimony, pointing others back to the God who sustains you. In this way, pressure not only proves your assignment to you, but it also demonstrates your assignment to the world watching you. So when the weight feels unbearable, when life seems to press in from every side, recognize the hidden message inside that struggle. You are not simply carrying random pain. You are carrying evidence of divine purpose. Pressure may not feel like a gift, but it is a signpost of assignment. It announces that your life is too significant to remain untouched, too vital to remain untested, and too full of potential to remain unshaped. Opposition has a way of showing up the moment you begin to walk in who you truly are. The very fact that resistance rises against you is evidence that there is something on your life worth fighting. Darkness never wastes its energy on what does not threaten it. When you feel targeted, criticized, or attacked without cause, it is often a signal that you have stepped into an identity that carries weight in the spiritual realm. The storms you face are not random. They are a reaction to the authority you carry. From the beginning of time, identity has always been attacked. Adam and Eve were created in the image of God, and immediately the serpent targeted that identity, twisting words and sowing doubt. If the enemy can confuse who you are, he can delay what you are called to do. That is why opposition so often comes in the form of lies about your worth, your purpose, or your future. The battle is less about what you do and more about who you are. Look at David when he faced Goliath. His brothers opposed him before he ever stepped onto the battlefield, questioning his motives and belittling his presence. Goliath mocked him, calling him unqualified and insignificant. Yet every word of opposition was confirmation that David was the one chosen to bring down the giant. If he were truly irrelevant, no one would have bothered to silence him. The attack revealed his assignment, and the opposition exposed his identity as Israel's defender. The life of Joseph also demonstrates this truth. His dreams identified him as someone destined for leadership and influence. The moment he shared them, opposition erupted, first in jealousy from his brothers, then in betrayal that led him into slavery, and later in false accusations that placed him in prison. Each layer of opposition was painful, but each layer was proof that his identity as a ruler could not be denied. If the enemy fought him so hard, it was only because the promise on his life was that significant. Jesus himself encountered relentless opposition, not only from demons but from religious leaders who constantly tried to discredit him. They questioned his authority, mocked his origins, and plotted his death. Yet every attempt to stop him only highlighted his identity as the Son of God. The intensity of the resistance confirmed the magnitude of his mission. If he had not been who he claimed to be, opposition would not have chased him with such force. Opposition is also a refining agent. It presses you to stand firm in who you are, even when circumstances tempt you to doubt. When Daniel refused to bow to the king's decree, his identity as a servant of the living God was tested in the lion's den. The opposition was fierce, yet it only solidified his allegiance to God. The moment you choose to embrace your true identity, you must expect resistance, because opposition clarifies where you stand and who you belong to. Sometimes the opposition comes through people closest to you. Friends may question your choices, family may misunderstand your calling, and even colleagues may resist your growth. But this too is confirmation. It reveals that you are walking a path not everyone is assigned to walk. Identity separates, and separation invites conflict. Yet the very friction you face is proof that you are not blending into the crowd. You are standing out as one marked for a greater purpose. Opposition also awakens perseverance. Without resistance, your identity remains untested. The more the enemy pushes back, the more you are forced to anchor yourself in truth. Every time you withstand criticism, overcome betrayal, or endure hardship, your confidence in who you are grows stronger. Opposition forces you to choose. Will you abandon your identity for the sake of ease, or will you hold fast to it, even when it costs you? That choice becomes the proving ground of destiny. There is also an authority that comes only through surviving opposition. Once you have endured attacks and remained unshaken, you carry a credibility that cannot be manufactured. Your scars become your credentials. People listen not just because of what you say, but because of what you have lived through. Opposition gives weight to your testimony, and your identity becomes undeniable because it has been proven in the fire of resistance. When opposition rises, it is not simply to block you, it is to reveal you. The pushback you face is an announcement that you have stepped into territory that matters. Your identity as chosen, called, and set apart becomes clearest when it is challenged. Without enemies, you would never know the extent of your authority. Without resistance, you would never recognize the strength of your identity. The battle confirms what heaven has already declared about you. Obedience has always been the key that unlocks the doors of destiny. It is not talent, intelligence, or connections that determine how far a person goes in the kingdom of God, but the willingness to submit to his instructions. When Abraham was told to leave his country and his family, he had no map, no clear destination, and no guarantee of safety. Yet his obedience set in motion a covenant that blessed generations. His destiny was not unlocked by understanding every detail, but by trusting the one who gave the command. There is a difference between hearing God and obeying Him. Many people hear His voice, but only those who act on it see the fullness of His promises. Noah didn't just hear God say to build an ark. He obeyed, even when the world laughed and rain was nowhere in sight. His obedience preserved humanity. The assignment on his life was too great to be fulfilled through partial compliance. Destiny always requires full obedience, not selective agreement. Sometimes obedience feels costly, and that is because it is. Moses had to obey God by confronting Pharaoh, even though he felt unqualified and insecure about his speech. Every step of obedience drew him closer to fulfilling his destiny as Israel's deliverer. Had he refused, the Red Sea would never have parted, and the journey to the promised land would never have begun. Obedience pulls you out of your excuses and places you in the flow of God's power. Obedience also requires trust when the path does not make sense. Joshua was instructed to bring down the walls of Jericho not with weapons, but with marching and shouting. To human reasoning, it was foolish. Yet obedience to that unconventional command released supernatural power. The walls fell because faith was paired with obedience. Destiny is never unlocked by logic alone. It is revealed in surrender to divine direction no matter how unusual it appears. Delayed obedience is often the enemy of destiny. Every time God gives an instruction, it is tied to timing. When Lot's wife looked back instead of obeying fully, she missed the deliverance that was within her grasp. When King Saul partially obeyed by sparing what God had commanded to destroy, he forfeited his throne. Obedience cannot be halfway. Destiny is unlocked by complete alignment with God's will, even when it conflicts with human desire. Jesus demonstrated the ultimate example of obedience in the Garden of Gethsemane. Faced with the agony of the cross, he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." That surrender unlocked salvation for the world. His obedience, though painful, was the pathway to the fulfillment of his mission. It is a reminder that sometimes obedience leads us through suffering. But on the other side of that suffering is glory, victory, and destiny fulfilled. Obedience is not just about external action, it is about the posture of the heart. God told Samuel that obedience is better than sacrifice. This means that no amount of outward ritual can replace the power of inward submission. A surrendered heart is what positions you for promotion in God's kingdom. Destiny cannot be unlocked through empty motions. It is revealed when the heart yields completely to the voice of God. At times, obedience may separate you from others. Those around you may not understand why you are making certain choices, turning down certain opportunities, or walking away from certain paths. But destiny is not for everyone to understand, it is for you to obey. Noah's neighbors could not grasp his assignment. Abraham's family could not see his future. When you obey, you often walk a lonely road, but that road leads to divine fulfillment. Obedience also aligns you with divine provision. When Elijah obeyed God's command to hide by the brook, ravens brought him food. When the widow obeyed the instruction to pour out her last bit of oil, it multiplied into abundance. Provision flows where obedience leads. Many people miss their blessing, not because God failed to provide, but because they refused to obey the direction that would have positioned them for the miracle. Ultimately, obedience is the bridge between promise and manifestation. God may have declared a future over your life, but it is obedience that carries you there. Every act of surrender, every step of faith, every moment of saying yes, when it would be easier to say no, pushes you closer to the destiny that has been written for you. Obedience unlocks what talent, effort, and ambition never could. It is the master key that opens the doors of purpose designed by heaven. God's favor is not a light thing to carry. When his hand rests upon a life, it brings weight along with blessing. Many people pray for favor, but few understand that favor does not come wrapped in ease. Mary was highly favored, yet her favor led her into the challenge of carrying the Savior while being misunderstood by her community. Favor marked her as chosen, but it also marked her for scrutiny. The weight of favor is not meant to crush you, but to prepare you for the impact of what you carry. When God places favor on you, opportunities begin to open, but so does opposition. Doors swing wide that no man can shut, yet the moment they open, adversaries rise to challenge you. Joseph found this out the hard way. His coat of many colors was a symbol of favor, but that same coat provoked the jealousy of his brothers. His journey into the palace came through betrayal, slavery, and prison. Favor rested on him, but it was heavy. It tested his endurance and his faithfulness before it elevated him to rulership. The heaviness of favor is also seen in the life of Moses. God chose him to deliver Israel, granting him the favor of miraculous signs and divine authority. But that favor came with the burden of leading a stubborn, complaining people through the wilderness. Every miracle he performed seemed to be followed by murmuring. Yet it was the favor of God that sustained him through the frustration. Favor will attract challenges, but it also supplies strength to bear them. Favor is heavy because it separates you from the ordinary. While others can live casually, you find yourself compelled to live consecrated. You cannot go where everyone goes or do what everyone does. The call on your life demands discipline, and the favor on your life demands responsibility. Esther discovered this when she was elevated to the palace. Her beauty gave her access, but her obedience gave her purpose. Her favor carried the weight of saving her people, and without her courage, that favor would have gone unused. There is also a weight of expectation that comes with favor. People begin to look at you differently, expecting more, sometimes even demanding more. David was anointed with favor as a young shepherd boy, yet that anointing placed him in battles far larger than himself. Goliath was not just an enemy, he was an assignment attached to David's favor. The weight of favor pushed David to confront giants, and in doing so, it revealed the depth of his destiny. The heaviness of favor often makes you walk through seasons of hiddenness before elevation. God uses private struggles to strengthen those carrying public favor. Before Jesus performed miracles, he endured 40 days in the wilderness, tested and tempted by the enemy. His favor was undeniable, but it was heavy, demanding endurance before manifestation. Hidden seasons with God are often proof that his favor is preparing you for something too great to handle prematurely. Favor also brings the burden of stewardship. When God entrusts you with influence, gifts, or opportunities, you must manage them wisely. The parable of the talents shows that favor is not free of responsibility. Those who are faithful with little are trusted with much. The weight of favor is not just about enjoying blessings, but about multiplying them for the sake of the kingdom. It demands that you carry the blessing in a way that glorifies God and serves others. Another reason favor is heavy is because it attracts spiritual warfare. The enemy sees the mark of God on your life and seeks to destroy it before it matures. Jesus was barely born when Herod sought to kill him. Favor had announced his identity, and with it came immediate attack. The heavier the favor, the fiercer the fight, because the impact of your assignment threatens the plans of darkness. Opposition is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign of how valuable your favor truly is. The weight of favor also stretches your faith. It compels you to trust God beyond your own strength or understanding. Peter was favored to walk on water, but that favor demanded faith that defied logic. Without stepping out of the boat, he would never have experienced the supernatural. Favor is not about comfort. It is about stretching you into realms you could never enter on your own. The heaviness forces you to lean on God in ways that ease never could. Ultimately, the heaviness of favor is balanced by the fruit it produces. The cost is high, but the impact is eternal. Those who carry God's favor may feel the pressure of misunderstanding, opposition, and responsibility, yet they also see lives changed, doors opened, and purposes fulfilled that far outweigh the struggle. Favor may be heavy, but the testimony it births makes every burden worth bearing. Isolation is one of the most misunderstood seasons in life. When God pulls you away from the noise of the crowd and places you in silence, it can feel like abandonment, but in truth it is an invitation. He removes distractions not to punish you, but to draw you closer to him. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he ever stood before Pharaoh, and in that hidden place God revealed himself in a burning bush. The isolation became the stage for intimacy, and intimacy became the foundation for destiny. When you are isolated, the familiar voices that once guided you grow quiet, and you are left with the voice of God as your anchor. It is in that solitude that his whispers become clearer. Elijah discovered this when he fled to the mountain. Broken and exhausted, he looked for God in the wind, the fire, and the earthquake, but the Lord came in a gentle whisper. That moment of isolation stripped away the noise so Elijah could hear the sound that truly mattered. Isolation has a way of reshaping priorities. When you no longer have the validation of crowds or the comfort of companionship, you discover that your identity cannot rest in external approval. David learned this while tending sheep in fields far from recognition. It was in those lonely hours with only the sheep and the stars that he learned to worship, to pray, and to trust in God's presence alone. The songs he sang in obscurity became the psalms that would bless nations. The hidden seasons of isolation are also training grounds. Before Joseph ruled Egypt, he endured the isolation of slavery and prison. Stripped of family, reputation, and freedom, he was forced to rely solely on the God of his fathers. In those quiet, unseen years, God was building the wisdom, resilience, and faith Joseph would need to govern in the time of famine. Without the isolation, the elevation would have been impossible to sustain. There is a sacred intimacy that can only be cultivated when you are set apart from the noise. Crowds can celebrate you, but they cannot shape you. Applause can encourage you, but it cannot refine you. God uses the wilderness of isolation to carve his image deeper into your heart. Jesus himself withdrew from the multitudes to pray in lonely places because he understood that intimacy with the Father required solitude with the Father. Isolation also reveals idols. When you are cut off from business, entertainment, and human affirmation, what you truly depend on rises to the surface. It is there that God exposes misplaced trust and gently replaces it with his presence. Israel experienced this in the wilderness after leaving Egypt. Away from the comforts of familiarity, they were confronted with the question of whether they would trust God daily for manna and water, or whether they would cling to the memory of Egypt's chains. In seasons of isolation, God often plants vision. It is when everything else is stripped away that you can finally see clearly. The Apostle John was exiled to the island of Patmos, a lonely place far from the churches he once served. Yet it was in that place of isolation that he received the revelation of Jesus Christ, a vision so powerful that it continues to shape faith centuries later. Isolation did not silence his ministry, it deepened it. Isolation also strengthens character. Without the pressure of public expectation, you are free to wrestle with God in private. Jacob wrestled alone at night before his name was changed to Israel. That solitary struggle marked him forever, not because of the opinions of others, but because of an encounter with God that reshaped his destiny. In the same way, your greatest transformations are often born out of the moments no one else sees. Isolation humbles the soul. It strips away the illusion of control and reminds you that everything you are and everything you have comes from God alone. Paul spent years in relative obscurity after his conversion before stepping into his full ministry. During those years, God was teaching him dependence, humility, and depth that would later spill out in letters filled with revelation and power. Isolation was not wasted. It was woven into his calling. When God leads you into isolation, it is because he longs for closeness that cannot be cultivated in the chaos. It is his way of saying that before he uses you publicly, he wants to know you privately. The hidden place becomes holy ground where intimacy is forged, faith is strengthened, and destiny is prepared in silence. It is in those moments alone with him that you discover the power of his presence, the sweetness of his voice, and the security of his love. Delays have a way of testing the human heart like nothing else. When God gives a promise and time begins to stretch between the word spoken and the word fulfilled, the waiting can feel unbearable. Yet delays are not God's way of withholding, they are His way of preparing. Abraham and Sarah learned this truth when the promise of a child seemed slow in coming. Year after year passed, and doubt whispered loudly, but in the fullness of time, Isaac was born. The delay was not denial, it was alignment with divine timing. Delays train patience, and patience is a requirement for destiny. Without it, the weight of a blessing can become a burden instead of a gift. Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, not because God had forgotten them, but because their hearts were not yet ready for the land He had promised. The delay was a classroom, teaching them dependence, obedience, and resilience. Destiny cannot be rushed because character must grow deep enough to sustain it. When God delays, He is often protecting you from stepping into something too soon. A blessing out of season can become destructive. Joseph's dreams showed him ruling, but if he had been elevated to the palace as a teenager, immaturity would have destroyed him. The pit, the prison, and the years of waiting were all part of the process to mature him for the throne. The delay was not God saying no, but God saying, not yet. But delays also expose motives. When you do not receive what you want as quickly as you expect, the posture of your heart is revealed. Do you serve God only for what He gives, or do you remain faithful even when His hand seems still? Hannah prayed for years for a child, and in that waiting her desire was refined. By the time Samuel was born, her heart was surrendered enough to dedicate him fully to the Lord. The delay purified her request and deepened her devotion. Sometimes delays are God's way of orchestrating details beyond your view. Esther was placed in the palace long before her people faced destruction. But the timing of her elevation was perfectly aligned with their need for deliverance. Had things moved sooner or later, the outcome would have been different. God's delays are often the weaving together of people, places, and opportunities so that His plan unfolds with precision. Delays are also opportunities for intimacy. When you cannot move forward as quickly as you desire, you are given space to lean deeper into God's presence. David spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves and wilderness places, long before he wore the crown. Those hidden years were filled with psalms, prayers, and songs of worship that flowed out of his waiting. The crown came in time, but the intimacy with God that was forged in delay became his greatest treasure. In seasons of delay, faith is either strengthened or abandoned. Waiting stretches trust in ways that instant answers never could. Abraham looked at his body and Sarah's womb and saw impossibility, yet he chose to believe that what God promised, He was able to perform. Faith that survives delay is faith that matures, growing roots strong enough to hold when storms come. The delay is a test, but it is also a gift, shaping faith into something unshakable. Delays may also serve as protection from unseen battles. What looks like slowness may actually be God clearing the path ahead of you. Israel faced this when God led them the long way around instead of the shorter path through Philistine territory. The delay spared them from wars they were not yet ready to fight. What feels like detour is often deliverance, shielding you from battles that would have overwhelmed you prematurely. Every delay carries the potential for growth if embraced with the right perspective. It stretches endurance, reshapes desires, and strengthens dependence. Waiting is not wasted when it is placed in God's hands. Each day of delay is a seed planted in the soil of destiny, and in due time it bears fruit. The longer the seed remains buried, the greater the harvest when it finally breaks through the soil. When the promise finally arrives, the delay makes it all the more meaningful. The joy of Isaac's birth, the triumph of Joseph's rise, the victory of David's crown, all were magnified by the years of waiting that preceded them. Delay does not diminish the promise. It magnifies its fulfillment. What God has spoken may seem slow, but His timing is perfect, and every second of waiting is working for a glory far greater than what was first imagined. Testing has a way of pulling back the layers of comfort and exposing what lies beneath. It is in the heat of trials that the depth of faith is revealed. When everything is easy, it's simple to declare trust in God. But when circumstances shake the ground beneath you, the test becomes the proving ground of your heart. Abraham experienced this when he was asked to place Isaac on the altar. The test was not about taking the child away, but about proving where Abraham's trust ultimately rested. Testing teaches reliance, and reliance strengthens trust. Testing is not meant to destroy you, but to refine you. Just as gold is purified by fire, your faith is purified through trials. Without testing, faith remains shallow, unproven, and fragile. With testing, it becomes durable, unshakable, and real. Job's life stands as a witness to this truth. Everything he owned was stripped away, yet through the pain, his declaration rang out, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." Testing forged his trust into something eternal, a trust not dependent on blessings, but on the very character of God. Testing also prepares you for greater responsibility. Before God can trust you with influence, He must first see how you handle obscurity. Before He can trust you with abundance, He must watch how you steward lack. The wilderness was Israel's test before the promised land, and every trial was an opportunity to prove whether they would trust the God who parted the sea to also provide manna in the desert. Their failures in testing delayed their destiny, showing us that how we handle the test determines how quickly we step into the next season. The tests of life often come in small, quiet ways before the bigger ones arrive. David faced the lion and the bear while tending sheep, long before he faced Goliath in the valley. Each smaller test built trust, preparing him for the greater battle. Without passing the unseen tests in the fields, he would not have had the courage to stand before the giant. Testing builds layer upon layer of confidence in God's faithfulness, until trusting Him becomes second nature in the face of impossible odds. Testing exposes weaknesses, not to shame, but to strengthen. It reveals the cracks in character that need God's touch before the weight of destiny can rest upon you. Peter's denial of Christ was a painful test, but it prepared him to trust not in his own strength, but in the grace of God. That same Peter who once crumbled in fear later stood boldly on the day of Pentecost, proclaiming Christ with power. The failure in testing became the foundation for deeper trust. Testing shifts your focus from self-sufficiency to God-dependency. It removes the illusion that you can navigate life on your own and drives you into the arms of the one who holds all things together. Paul wrote of being pressed beyond measure, to the point of despair, so that he would not rely on himself, but on God who raises the dead. The crushing weight of the test redirected his trust from his own strength to the limitless power of God. In testing, God often withholds explanations to cultivate pure trust. Trust doesn't always come with answers. Sometimes it comes with silence. Joseph sat in prison, forgotten by men, yet he continued to trust the God who had given him dreams. The test was not in understanding the why, but in believing despite the why not. Trust forged in unanswered questions is trust that cannot be shaken when storms rage. Testing also prepares you for empathy. When you have walked through fire and discovered God's faithfulness firsthand, you carry a testimony that can strengthen others in their storms. Paul declared that the comfort he received in trials became the comfort he offered to others. Trust built in testing becomes a reservoir of encouragement, reminding others that if God was faithful then, He will be faithful again. Every test you endure is a stepping stone toward deeper trust. It strips away pride, uproots fear, and establishes confidence in God's unchanging nature. Testing transforms faith from theory to reality, from words to lived experience. It's in the trial that you discover God is not just the God of Sunday sermons, but the God of midnight tears and unanswered prayers. Each test builds the muscle of trust until you are able to stand firm no matter what comes. The greatest rewards of trust are often birthed from the deepest tests. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced the furnace. Yet their trust was so strong that even the threat of death did not move them. In the fire, they discovered not only God's power, but His presence. Testing did not consume them. It introduced them to the God who walks in the flames. Trust forged in testing carries a weight of glory that no comfort ever could. Brokenness is something most people run from, yet it is often the very place where God does His deepest work. When a seed remains whole, it cannot release what is inside of it. Only when it is buried and broken open does new life spring forth. In the same way, breakthrough rarely comes without brokenness. It is in the shattering of pride, self-reliance, and illusions of control that God unlocks the power of His Spirit within you. Brokenness has a way of softening the heart in ways comfort never can. When life is smooth, we lean on our own wisdom, our own strength, and our own plans. But when those plans collapse, when strength fails, and when wisdom proves insufficient, we discover the necessity of leaning on God. David's psalms overflow with cries from places of brokenness, moments where he had nothing left but God. Those very cries became psalms of worship that still lead millions into God's presence. Brokenness strips away the masks we wear. It exposes the raw, unpolished places that we often try to hide from others, and even from ourselves. Jacob had to be broken in a wrestling match with God before his name was changed to Israel. That breaking left him with a limp, a permanent reminder of his encounter, but it also marked the beginning of his transformation. His brokenness was the birthplace of his new identity. Brokenness also creates humility, and humility is the soil where breakthrough grows. A proud heart resists God, but a broken heart makes room for Him. The prodigal son only returned to his father after being broken in the far country. It was when everything else failed him that he came to himself and found his way back home. His breakthrough into restoration and identity as a son was birthed in the ashes of his brokenness. In brokenness, we discover that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. Paul pleaded 3 times for his thorn to be removed, but God's answer was not deliverance from the weakness. It was grace in the weakness. That thorn kept Paul dependent on the sufficiency of Christ, and it was through that brokenness that power flowed. What looked like limitation became the very channel of breakthrough. Brokenness teaches surrender. It brings us to a place where we stop fighting to control outcomes and yield everything to God's hands. Hannah wept bitterly before the Lord when she longed for a child. It was in her broken prayer that she surrendered fully, vowing to dedicate the child back to God if He granted her request. Out of her tears came Samuel, a prophet who would anoint kings and guide a nation. Her breakthrough came because of her brokenness. Brokenness often isolates, but it is in that isolation that God whispers His deepest truths. Elijah, under the broom tree, cried out for his life to end, broken and weary from battle. It was in that fragile state that God met him, not with condemnation, but with gentle provision and a still, small voice. The prophet who felt shattered discovered that God was closest in the moments of his deepest brokenness. Brokenness is also where compassion is born. When you have been shattered and restored by God, you carry a tenderness for others who are hurting. Peter's bitter tears after denying Jesus became the foundation for his bold compassion in leading the early church. Having experienced grace in his brokenness, he could extend grace to others. What once was shame became strength, and what once was weakness became a well of mercy. Brokenness clears the way for God's glory. When Gideon's army carried jars with torches hidden inside, the light did not shine until the jars were broken. The breaking released the brilliance that had been concealed. In the same way, when your life is broken, the light of Christ within you shines all the brighter. The treasure in jars of clay is revealed when the vessel is cracked, proving that the power belongs to God and not to us. Every breakthrough is preceded by a breaking. It is in the breaking that pride is crushed, idols are destroyed, and dependence on God is solidified. The places where you feel shattered are often the very places where God is preparing to pour out his Spirit. Brokenness is not the end. It is the doorway through which true breakthrough enters, releasing life, power, and transformation that could never come through strength alone. Weakness is something the world despises, but in the kingdom of God, weakness is not a liability. It is an invitation. When you come to the end of yourself, that is when God begins to display his power most clearly. Paul discovered this truth when he pleaded with the Lord to remove the thorn in his flesh. Instead of relief, he received a revelation. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What seemed like a limitation became the very stage for God's strength to shine. Weakness strips away the illusion of self-sufficiency. As long as you believe you can handle everything in your own strength, you will never know the depth of God's sustaining power. Israel discovered this when they stood trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea. Their weakness was undeniable, their escape impossible. Yet it was in that very moment that God's strength split the waters and made a way where none existed. Weakness opened the door to a miracle that human power could never achieve. Weakness has a way of producing humility, and humility is the posture that draws God's presence. A heart that acknowledges its need for him is a heart that can receive his power. Gideon felt unqualified and small when God called him to deliver Israel. By human standards, his weakness disqualified him. But God deliberately reduced his army to make it even clearer that the victory would come not by might, nor by power, but by the Spirit of the Lord. Weakness became the testimony that the battle belonged to God. In weakness, dependence becomes second nature. David, though anointed as king, spent years running for his life, hiding in caves and relying on God's provision. He had no army, no throne, no security, just a sling, a song, and a God who never failed him. Those years of weakness trained him to lean fully on God's strength. By the time he ascended to the throne, his heart was anchored not in his own ability, but in the faithfulness of the Lord. Weakness also reveals where your true foundation lies. When storms strike, it becomes clear whether you are standing on sand or on rock. Peter's weakness showed itself in his denial of Christ, but that very moment became the turning point of his faith. When restored by Jesus, Peter carried a boldness that no weakness could erase. His past failure no longer defined him, God's strength within him did. Out of his weakness rose a pillar of the early church. In weakness, you encounter the sufficiency of grace. Grace is not just unmerited favor, it is divine empowerment to endure and overcome. Paul's thorn did not disappear, but grace made him strong enough to continue. Your weakness may not vanish, but grace covers it, upholds it, and transforms it into a place where God's strength is magnified. What looks like a handicap becomes the evidence that his hand is carrying you. Weakness also becomes a testimony to others. People may admire your strength, but they are inspired by how you trust God in weakness. When they see you stand firm through trials, not because you are strong, but because God is holding you, it becomes a witness of his reality. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood in weakness before a fiery furnace, powerless to save themselves. Yet their trust allowed God's strength to reveal his presence in the flames. Their weakness gave God the platform for his glory. In seasons of weakness, prayer often deepens. When you cannot rely on yourself, you cry out to the one who is able. Hannah wept bitterly before God in her barrenness, pouring out her soul with nothing left to give. Out of her weakness came a prophetic son who would shift the destiny of a nation. Her weakness became the womb for a miracle, reminding us that what seems like deficiency is often the soil of divine strength. Weakness reshapes identity. The world defines people by what they can do, but God defines them by who they are in him. Moses claimed he could not speak well, yet God used that very man to confront Pharaoh and deliver Israel. His weakness in speech did not disqualify him. It became the backdrop for God's mighty works. Through weakness, you learn that your value and calling are not measured by ability, but by availability to God's strength. When weakness is surrendered, it becomes holy ground. It is no longer something to hide, but something to bring before God. Every crack, every limitation, every fragile place becomes a vessel through which his power flows. The treasure in jars of clay is not diminished by the weakness of the vessel. It is magnified because of it. When the jar cracks, the light shines brighter. And when the heart bows low, the strength of God rises high. So don't despise the struggle. Don't curse the weight. Don't question the separation. Instead, lift your head and recognize you are dangerously set apart by God. What you're facing is not the end of your story. It's the birth of a greater one. What tried to break you will only prove that you cannot be broken. What was meant to silence you will only amplify your voice. Stand firm, walk boldly, live faithfully. Because when God sets you apart, he doesn't just prepare you. He uses you to shake the world.